Some stories aren't meant to be told. They're meant to be passed down. In the kind of remote farming communities where everyone knows everyone, people rarely speak about certain things in broad daylight. Those stories only come out after sunset, when the conversation gets quieter and someone finally says, "This happened to a man I knew." Most people laugh them off, until they hear the same story from someone else, then someone else, and eventually they stop asking whether it really happened. This is one of those stories. It happened in a small rural town where a single old general store stood at the intersection of two dusty country roads. One road led back toward civilization. The other disappeared into miles of isolated ranches, forgotten homesteads, and stretches of dry countryside where cell service vanished long before the pavement did. The store had been there for generations. Walter had inherited it from his father, who had inherited it from his own. It wasn't much to look at: a weathered wooden building with faded shelves, a humming drink cooler, feed sacks hanging from the ceiling to keep them away from moisture, and a front porch where neighbors lingered longer than they shopped. Life followed the same rhythm every day. He unlocked the doors at 6 in the morning, closed them at 6 in the evening, sold feed, fuel, groceries, tools, and the occasional bottle of liquor. He knew nearly every face that walked through the door: the propane delivery driver, the ranchers buying mineral salt, families who still paid their tab at the end of every month. Nothing ever surprised him. Not until one Tuesday evening. It was late summer. The sun hung low over the road, turning the drifting dust into ribbons of gold. Walter was straightening a shelf near the front window when he heard the distant growl of an engine. Nothing unusual. Vehicles passed by all the time. Still, something about this one made him glance outside. An old white pickup rolled to a slow stop in front of the store. The engine idled for a few seconds before falling silent. The driver's door opened. A tall, thin man stepped out. He wore a worn leather hat pulled low over his face and a long-sleeved shirt despite the lingering heat that still shimmered above the road. Walter frowned. He didn't recognize him. And in a place where strangers were remembered long after they left. That was unusual. The man walked inside without hesitation, gave a single polite nod. "Good afternoon." Walter returned it. "Afternoon. What can I get for you?" The stranger's answer came without a second of hesitation. "A 1-liter bottle of moonshine." Walter reached for the bottle, set it gently on the counter, and watched as the man pulled an old $20 bill from his pocket. The paper looked unusually worn, soft around the edges, almost as if it had been folded and unfolded for years. Walter handed him his change. "Need anything else?" The man wrapped one hand around the bottle. "No, nothing more. No small talk. No questions. No introduction." He simply turned around, walked back outside, climbed into the pickup, and disappeared down the lonely road that led deeper into the backcountry. Walter watched the cloud of dust trail behind the truck until it finally disappeared beyond the hills. He shrugged. Probably someone from a ranch farther out. That happened from time to time. But when the same white pickup returned, the following Tuesday, at exactly the same time, asking for exactly the same bottle, Walter began to wonder if the man wasn't following a routine, but keeping an appointment. The third Tuesday felt less like a coincidence. By the fourth, Walter caught himself checking the clock every few minutes. 5:27, 5:28, 5:29. Right on schedule, the distant rumble of an engine drifted across the quiet countryside. A few seconds later, the old white pickup rolled into view. It never arrived early. It was never late. Always the same truck. Always the same man. Always the same bottle. Week after week, nothing changed. The stranger parked in the exact same spot, stepped inside with the same measured pace, nodded once, placed an old $20 bill on the counter, took his bottle of moonshine, and drove away toward the isolated backcountry. The routine became so precise that Walter no longer needed to look outside. He knew the truck had arrived simply by the sound of its engine. It became another part of the store's rhythm, until curiosity finally got the better of him. One Tuesday, while reaching for the bottle, Walter smiled. "You from one of the ranches out past Miller Creek?" The man looked at him for only a moment. "Farther." His voice was calm, almost empty. Walter tried again. "You live out there by yourself?" A brief pause. "No." That was all. No explanation. No conversation. Just enough words to answer the question, and nothing more. The stranger paid, picked up the bottle, and walked back to his truck without looking over his shoulder. Walter stood in the doorway, watching him disappear into another cloud of dust. Something about the whole thing bothered him. Not because the man was rude. Because he wasn't. He was polite, respectful, but there was a strange distance about him, as if every visit had only one purpose. Nothing else mattered. Summer faded into fall. Then fall gave way to early winter. The Tuesdays never changed. Not once. Until one week. The pickup never came. Walter looked at the clock. 5:30. 5:45. 6 o'clock. The road stayed empty. For the first time in nearly 4 months, the routine had been broken. He locked the front door that evening with an uneasy feeling he couldn't explain. He kept telling himself it didn't matter. People traveled. Trucks broke down. Life happened. Still, the silence where that familiar engine should have been felt strangely unsettling. A full week later, Tuesday arrived again. 5:29. Almost on cue, the low growl of the pickup echoed across the road. Walter looked through the window. The old white truck. The same man. Nothing appeared different. When the stranger stepped inside, Walter couldn't help himself. "You missed last week." For the first time since they'd met, the man looked directly into his eyes. His face showed little emotion. Just exhaustion. "I was away." Walter nodded slowly. "Everything all right?" The man rested one hand on the bottle after Walter set it on the counter. "Yeah." A long silence settled between them. Then, almost as if he had spoken to himself, the stranger quietly added, "The old man had to wait." Walter blinked. "I'm sorry." "Who?" The man slipped the bottle into a paper bag. "The old man." Another pause. "The one I buy this for." Before Walter could ask another question, the stranger turned, pushed open the screen door, and walked back to his truck. Walter remained standing behind the counter long after the engine had faded into the distance. The store suddenly felt much quieter than it had a minute earlier. He stared at the empty doorway. Who needed a bottle of liquor every single Tuesday? 4 months. Without fail. And more importantly, who was this old man that couldn't simply buy it himself? Walter tried to convince himself it wasn't his business. People in the countryside valued their privacy. If a man wanted to drive out to the middle of nowhere every Tuesday with a bottle of liquor, that was his choice. Still, the question refused to leave him alone. Who was waiting at the end of that road? Over the next few days, he asked around as casually as he could. An elderly rancher who had lived in the area for over 30 years shook his head. "Never seen a white pickup like that." Another customer, a ranch hand who seemed to know every back road within 50 miles, thought for a moment before answering. "No idea who you're talking about. Folks farther out keep to themselves, but somebody would have heard of him." No one had. The more Walter asked, the stranger the silence became. The following Tuesday, The truck arrived exactly as it always did. The man bought his usual bottle, paid with another worn $20 bill, nodded once, and drove away. This time, Walter had already made up his mind. As soon as the pickup disappeared over the hill, he locked the store early, climbed into his own truck, and followed at a distance. The road narrowed with every mile. The pavement disappeared, replaced by loose gravel that soon gave way to packed dirt. The farther he drove, the fewer signs of life remained. He passed a couple of isolated ranches, then a tiny settlement that looked almost forgotten. After that, nothing. Only open fields, dry brush, weathered fences, and an endless silence that seemed to swallow the sound of his engine. Nearly 20 minutes later, he spotted the white pickup. It was parked beside an old farmhouse standing completely alone. Walter slowed instinctively. The place looked abandoned. Part of the roof had collapsed years ago. Several windows were missing. The porch leaned slightly to one side, and weeds had grown so high they nearly swallowed the front steps. No smoke, no lights, no movement. The stranger stepped out carrying the bottle in one hand. Without looking around, he walked inside. Then, nothing. Walter waited. 5 minutes. 10. 15. The front door never opened again. A breeze stirred the dead grass around the house. Somewhere far off, a crow called once. Then everything went quiet again. The silence became so complete that Walter could hear his own heartbeat. He finally opened his truck door. Each step toward the farmhouse felt heavier than the last. The old wooden gate stood half open, swaying gently in the wind. Its rusted hinges let out a long, tired creak. Walter reached the side of the house and stopped beneath a cracked window. For a moment, he only listened. Nothing. No voices. No footsteps. Not even the sound of someone moving inside. He slowly raised his head and looked through the dusty glass. At first, the room appeared completely empty. Only dirt. Broken walls. Thick webs hanging from the ceiling. Then his eyes adjusted. A large stone sat in the middle of the room. Resting on top of it was the open bottle. Beside it stood a worn plastic cup. Walter frowned. He leaned a little closer. And only then, he realized someone was sitting perfectly still against the far wall. An old man. Long white hair. A tangled gray beard. Clothes so worn they looked ready to fall apart. His eyes were closed. One hand loosely held the cup while the other rested across his lap. The stranger stood nearby without saying a word. Simply waiting. The old man lifted the cup with slow, trembling fingers. Took a sip. Then another. Walter felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Something about the scene wasn't merely strange. It was wrong. Not because of what the old man was doing. Because of the way everything else had become unnaturally still. Even the air inside the room seemed frozen. Then, the old man opened his eyes and looked directly through the window, straight at Walter. Walter stumbled backward before he even realized he had moved. His boot caught on a loose stone, sending him off balance. He threw out a hand to steady himself against the side of the house, then hurried back toward his truck without looking over his shoulder. Every instinct told him the same thing. Leave. Now. By the time he climbed behind the wheel, his pulse was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Gravel sprayed behind the tires as he sped away, refusing to check the rearview mirror until the abandoned farmhouse had completely disappeared behind the rolling hills. He barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the old man again. Not drinking, not moving, just staring. The following Tuesday arrived with the same heavy anticipation that had been building inside him for months. At exactly 5:30, the familiar white pickup pulled into the parking lot. The stranger walked inside. Walter already had the bottle waiting on the counter. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, Walter slid the bottle across the wood. The usual. The man nodded. As he reached for it, he paused. The old man saw you. Walter's hand froze. His mouth suddenly felt dry. I was just driving around. The stranger looked at him with tired eyes. He said you shouldn't have gone there. A chill crawled slowly up Walter's spine. He swallowed before asking the question that had haunted him for an entire week. Who is he? The man let out a long breath, as though he'd answered the question 100 times in his own head. My father. Walter frowned. He passed away 11 years ago. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The humming of the drink cooler seemed impossibly loud inside the empty store. My father drank every single day, the man continued quietly. When he died, I made him a promise. He rested one hand on the bottle. I told him I'd bring him a bottle every Tuesday. Walter couldn't find the words. The stranger stared at the floor. If I keep my promise. He hesitated. He stays there. A long silence followed. If I break it. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. He'll come looking for me. Without another word, he paid, picked up the bottle, and walked out. Walter watched the truck disappear once again into the fading evening light. This time, he didn't try to follow. Over the next few weeks, he did everything he could to convince himself it had all been some terrible misunderstanding. A trick of the light. An old man living off the grid. Anything but the explanation he'd been given. Yet every Tuesday, the white pickup returned. Every Tuesday, the bottle disappeared down that lonely road. Until one week, it didn't. 5:30 came and went. Then 6. The parking lot stayed empty. For reasons he couldn't explain, Walter felt relieved. Maybe it was finally over. Maybe whatever had kept that strange ritual alive had finally come to an end. The next morning, he unlocked the front door just after sunrise. Something immediately caught his eye. Sitting neatly on the concrete step outside the entrance was an empty bottle of moonshine. Beside it lay an old $20 bill. The same faded kind the stranger always used. Walter looked up and down the empty road. No vehicles. No footprints. No one in sight. He picked up the bill. The paper felt strangely damp and ice-cold. His fingers trembled as he turned it over. Written across the back in faded blue ink were 6 simple words. He's waiting for the next one. Walter drove to the abandoned farmhouse that same morning. The white pickup was parked outside. Its driver's door stood open. Inside the house, the stranger lay on the dirt floor. The medical examiner would later call it a heart attack. Quick. Natural. But Walter never cared about the official explanation. Because sitting on the same stone, holding the same plastic cup, was the old man. Exactly where he'd been before. Waiting. Walter sold the store 6 months later. Moved hundreds of miles away. Started over. He never drove that road again. But every now and then, late at night, he wonders what happens when Tuesday comes. Whether someone else found that old farmhouse. Whether another bottle is sitting on that stone. Or whether the old man is still there, patiently waiting for someone to keep a promise that never truly ended. Because some debts don't die with the people who made them. They simply wait for the next person willing, or unlucky enough, to pay them. There are stories that should not be told directly. They exist deep within the countryside like ancient whispers, passed from generation to generation, always in low voices, always after the sun disappears behind the hills. They say some things do not fully belong to the world of the living, nor to the world of the dead. And the more you try to ignore them, the more they insist on staying. This story took place in a small, isolated rural region on a farm forgotten by time, in the year 2015. At first, it all seemed like just another ordinary burial. But what was buried there never accepted staying beneath the ground. The earth was supposed to cover everything, but it didn't. A man had worked on that farm for years. Silent, accustomed to solitude, he knew every tree, every path, every sound of the night. Until the day the boss arrived with a strange request. An unusual burial. A coffin that was not to be questioned. And there was an unspoken rule in that place. After that day, nothing was ever normal again near that gamalira tree. The soil was fresh. It still carried that heavy smell of newly turned earth, mixed with torn roots and damp wood. The grave had been dug far from the road, under an old gamalira tree, where the wind always seemed colder than the rest of the farm. The kind of place that already felt like it was being watched, even when no one was around. They worked in silence. The shovel cutting into the ground. The dry sound of earth breaking apart. The coffin lowering slowly, as if its own weight resisted the movement. And then, the final impact. A hollow, definitive sound. As if something had been sealed forever. For a few minutes, everything stood still. Only the wind moving through the leaves. The boss stood there, silent, staring at the freshly covered ground. He didn't say much. He only made a gesture for silence, murmured a short prayer, and left without looking back. Daniel stayed. It was his job to make sure everything remained intact, that nothing was disturbed, that the earth did its duty. But even on that first night, something already felt wrong. The silence of the farm was not normal. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was as if the environment was waiting. In the middle of the night, Daniel woke up with a strange pressure in his chest. It wasn't a clear sound. It was more like a feeling, as if someone had passed very close to the window, without touching anything. He lay there for a few seconds, motionless, listening. The wind gently hit the wooden house. Outside, insects made their usual night sounds. Everything seemed normal. But his body didn't believe it. When he finally decided to look out the window, the yard was empty. The gamalira tree was still there. Silent. Still. But something about the outline of the ground around it was different. Subtle enough not to explain from a distance. He waited for dawn. And when the sun finally rose, he went out early. Slow steps, the earth still damp under his boots. The closer he got to the tree, the stronger the discomfort became. Until he saw it. The soil of the grave had slightly changed. It didn't look like wind, nor animals. It was as if the ground had been pushed from underneath. An irregular crack crossed the top of the burial site. Small, but real. Daniel stood still for a few seconds, staring, the shovel still resting on his shoulder. He took a deep breath, trying to convince himself it was normal. Animals, rain, natural movement of the soil. Anything except what his mind was beginning to imagine. But then he moved closer, and noticed something that made his stomach sink. The wooden cross that had been placed there the night before was not exactly where he remembered. It looked shifted, slightly tilted, as if someone had touched it during the night. He swallowed hard, looked around the farm. Nothing. Only still vegetation. Only the distant sound of the lake water. And that strange silence, heavier than before. Daniel decided not to interfere. Not yet. He covered the exposed area again carefully, leveled the soil, pressed it down with his foot. He stood there a few seconds, waiting for any sign of change. But nothing happened. When he returned to the house, He tried to forget, tried to treat it as a natural accident. But that night, the silence returned differently, closer, more present, as if something had realized he had noticed. That night, the silence returned differently, closer, more present, as if something had realized he had noticed. Daniel didn't sleep properly, not because he tried and failed, but because sleep itself felt like something that no longer fully reached him. Every time he closed his eyes, the same images returned: the cracked soil, the tilted cross, and that strange sensation of pressure coming from beneath the ground. It wasn't fear in the usual sense anymore. It was anticipation. Like the house itself was holding its breath with him. Around 2 a.m., he sat up in bed. He didn't know why. He just did. And in that moment, he noticed something worse than any sound. The silence outside had structure. It wasn't random anymore. It had rhythm. Long pauses. Short interruptions. Like something moving slowly across the farm, stopping often, as if listening back. Daniel stood up. His legs felt heavier than they should. He grabbed the flashlight without thinking too much about it. And then he stopped for a second at the door. The rational part of him tried to resist. But the other part, the one that had already seen the soil move, was stronger. He opened the door. The night air outside was colder than before. Not naturally colder. Artificially so. Like the temperature had been adjusted just enough to make the skin uncomfortable. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, but it felt weaker than usual, as if the air itself was absorbing light. Daniel walked slowly. Each step felt louder than it should have been. Not in sound, but in meaning. The farm was no longer just a place. It felt aware. As he approached the gamalira tree, the first thing he noticed was that the wind had stopped completely. Not softened. Stopped. Even the insects were gone. No crickets. No distant frogs. Nothing. Just pressure. Then he saw the ground. The soil around the grave was no longer just disturbed. It had changed shape. Subtly raised in places, like something beneath had pressed upward repeatedly, testing resistance. Daniel stopped walking. The flashlight shook slightly in his hand. And then, a sound. Very low. Almost beneath hearing. A dragging noise. Coming from inside the earth. He froze. It stopped instantly, as if whatever made it had noticed his attention. Then it came again. Closer. Stronger. Daniel stepped back instinctively. The beam of the flashlight hit the cross again. It was no longer just tilted. It was broken. Half of it lay partially buried, as if something had pushed it aside without breaking its path. Daniel swallowed hard. And then he saw something new. A thin line in the soil. Fresh. Stretching from the grave. Toward the direction of the house. For a few seconds, Daniel didn't move. His mind refused to connect what his eyes were seeing. It looked like a trail, but not in the way animals make trails. This was different. Too deliberate. Too continuous. As if something had tested direction, and then confirmed it. He followed it with the flashlight. Step by step. The line wasn't deep, but it was undeniable. The soil had been pressed down in a narrow path leading away from the grave. Toward him. Daniel took a step back. Then another. And in that exact moment, the ground behind him made a sound. A soft thump. Not loud, not violent, just final. He turned slowly. The flashlight beam moved before his body did, and for the first time, he saw it clearly. Not a shape in the distance, not a suggestion between trees. Something much closer. A mark in the soil, right behind where he had been standing. A footprint. but not fully formed. More like an impression that hadn't decided its shape completely. Half human, half wrong. Daniel's breath stopped, and then another one appeared, a few meters to the side. Then another, not walking fast, not running, just continuing. Daniel stepped backward toward the tree without realizing it. His mind was no longer trying to understand, only to react. The footprints were not random. They were surrounding him, slowly, patiently, like something learning how to exist in space properly. Then the dragging sound returned, this time not from the grave, but from the trees behind him. Daniel turned the flashlight. Nothing, just trunks, just darkness. But the air had changed again. He could feel it behind him now, close, too close. He turned again toward the grave instinctively, and saw it. The soil had split slightly wider, not open completely, but enough. Enough for something to be inside it that wasn't fully inside anymore. Something waiting for the last decision. And then, a voice, not spoken, not fully formed, but trying to become speech. It came from everywhere at once. Not directionally, not physically, inside the space itself. Daniel stumbled back. His heel hit something soft. The ground behind him was no longer stable. He almost fell, and in that moment, the flashlight flickered, just once, and in that flicker, something stood closer than it had been before. Daniel didn't remember dropping the flashlight. But at some point, the light hit the ground at an angle, enough to illuminate only fragments. A leg-like structure, too thin, too elongated, not fully aligned with human proportions. And above it, a torso that seemed unfinished, like something carved but never completed. The face wasn't visible, only the sense of where it should be. Daniel backed away. Slowly at first, then faster, but every step backward felt like it was being measured. The thing didn't rush. It didn't need to, because the grave behind it was still open, and something inside it was still moving. Daniel turned and ran. The house appeared too far, even though it wasn't. His legs burned instantly. The ground felt uneven, like it was subtly resisting his movement. Behind him, there was no chasing sound, no footsteps, no acceleration, only presence, constant, unbroken. Daniel slammed the door behind him and locked it. He leaned against it, breathing hard. For a few seconds, nothing happened. No sound outside, no movement, only silence again. But this silence was different. It wasn't absence. It was arrival. Daniel stepped away from the door slowly. And that's when he noticed it. The thin line of soil he had seen outside was now visible at the edge of the porch, as if it had already reached the house, and stopped, right at the threshold, waiting. Daniel didn't sleep after that. He sat on the floor near the wall, staring at the door, waiting for something that did not need permission anymore. And somewhere near dawn, he heard it. Not from outside, not from far away, from beneath the house. A soft pressure, like soil shifting against wood. Slow, deliberate, testing. And then, a single, gentle knock. From under the floorboards, not asking to enter, just confirming it already knew the way. The knock didn't repeat immediately. It didn't need to, because the meaning of it had already settled inside the house like dust. Daniel stayed still, every muscle in his body locked in place, as if movement itself might trigger something irreversible. The silence that followed wasn't empty anymore. It was occupied. Underneath the floorboards, something was there. Not just near. Not approaching. Already inside the structure of the house. Daniel slowly lowered his gaze to the wooden floor. The boards were old, uneven, and now, slightly tense, like a stretched surface holding pressure from below. Then it happened again. A second knock. This time closer to the center of the room. Not at the door. Not at the walls. Inside the house. Daniel backed away instinctively, pressing himself against the wall. His breathing was shallow, uneven. And then, a faint sound of wood adjusting. Not breaking. Not cracking. Adjusting. Like something underneath was repositioning itself to align with the space above. The floor creaked softly. Once. Then stopped. And in that pause, Daniel realized something worse than fear. Whatever was coming up was not forcing itself. It was integrating. Learning the structure. Mapping it. The house wasn't being invaded. It was being understood. Daniel rushed to the kitchen without thinking. He grabbed the only heavy object he could find, a metal tool, something old from the farm work. Not because he believed it would help, but because doing nothing felt worse. Another knock. This time behind him. From the hallway. Daniel spun around. Nothing visible. But the hallway light flickered slightly. Not due to electricity failure. Due to timing. Like something passed through it too quickly for the eye to register. Then, a soft dragging sound across the floorboards. Slow. Deliberate. Moving from the hallway toward the living room. Daniel stepped back into the kitchen corner. Cornering himself without realizing it. The sound stopped right outside the doorway. A pause. Long enough for his mind to try to fill the silence with hope. And then, a hand appeared. Not grabbing. Not striking. Just resting on the edge of the doorway. Thin. Dry. Almost careful. Like it was testing whether the surface would accept contact. Daniel froze completely. The hand didn't pull itself up. It simply stayed there. And then, more pressure came from below it. As if the rest of the body was slowly rising from under the floor. But not in a violent emergence. More like something that had been lying beneath a structure for too long, and was finally remembering how to occupy space above it. Daniel raised the metal tool slightly, his arms shaking, and at that moment, the thing stopped moving. Completely. The hand remained on the doorway, but everything else went still, and the silence returned again. Different now. Not waiting. Not watching. Deciding. Then, very softly, a sound came from it. Not words. Not language. But something shaped like recognition. Like a memory trying to surface through soil, wood, and time. Daniel felt his chest tighten. The air in the house grew heavier, and the floor beneath him responded. A slow upward pressure. From multiple points now. Not just one place. The entire house beginning to lift in small, uneven pulses. Like something underneath was fully awake. And stretching. Daniel stepped forward without thinking and struck the doorway with the metal tool. A loud impact. Too loud for the silence that had been holding everything. The sound shattered the moment. For a split second, everything paused. No movement. No pressure. No sound. And then, the hand withdrew slightly. Not retreating in fear, but in acknowledgement. Like it had confirmed something. Daniel didn't wait. He ran. He burst through the back door of the house and stumbled into the yard. The night outside felt wrong again. Heavier. Denser. But at least it wasn't enclosed. He kept running, past the trees, past the faint trail in the soil, until he reached a distance where the farm was partially visible again. And then he stopped, breathing hard, looking back. The house stood still, quiet, no movement, no light flicker, nothing. For a moment, Daniel almost believed it was over, that whatever had been under the ground had stopped. But then he noticed something. The soil leading from the grave, the same thin path, was no longer just on the ground. It extended further now, across the yard, across the space between him and the house. And it wasn't stopping. It was continuing outward, not toward him, not toward the house, but in multiple directions at once. Like something underground had stopped being localized entirely. Daniel's stomach dropped, because he finally understood what it meant. It was never trying to leave the grave. It was trying to map the entire place. The farm wasn't the target. It was the starting point. Behind him, the wind returned, but not naturally. It moved in a pattern, circular, around him, around the house, around the grave, as if the entire landscape had begun to rotate around something that no longer respected direction. Daniel took a step back, and the ground beneath his foot softened slightly, not collapsing, just acknowledging pressure. From below, he looked down, and saw it, a faint impression forming, right where he stood. Not a footprint this time, something larger, wider, as if the ground itself was beginning to accept a shape it had been rehearsing. Daniel backed away slowly, and then heard it. Not behind him, not in the house, everywhere at once. That same attempt at a voice, but now closer to completion, more structured, almost understandable, almost his name. And in that moment, Daniel understood the final truth. It was no longer coming out of the grave. It was coming out of the entire land. Daniel stood frozen. The sound was no longer just around him. It was inside the space itself, inside the air, the soil, the distance between objects. His name wasn't fully formed yet, but it was getting closer every time it returned. Not louder, more certain. The ground beneath him shifted again, not collapsing, not cracking, but aligning, like something enormous beneath the entire farm was adjusting its position in relation to him. Daniel took a step back, then another, and realized something terrifying. There was nowhere on the farm where the sensation didn't follow. The grave was no longer the center. He was. A low vibration spread through the soil, subtle at first, then undeniable. The trees reacted before the wind did, leaves trembling without air movement, branches stiffening as if resisting pressure from below. The house behind him creaked once, not from wind, from weight. Daniel turned slowly, and saw it. The farmhouse wasn't moving outward anymore. It was sinking inward, not collapsing, not breaking apart, but being gently pulled down, millimeter by millimeter, into the earth, as if the ground had decided it belonged there instead. His breath caught, and then he saw the grave again. From this distance, it should have been just a dark patch under the gamalira. But it wasn't. The soil above it had become smooth, too smooth, like a surface being polished from underneath. And then it happened. The land breathed. One single, massive inhale. The entire farm rose slightly, all at once, and Daniel felt it clearly in his chest, as if his own lungs were reacting to the same motion. Then, the exhale. The ground dropped, but not downward, inward, like a giant layer of soil had been turned into something flexible. And from that movement, the shape finally emerged. Not a body rising from a hole, not a figure walking out, but something far larger. The Gamalira tree split silently down the middle, not breaking violently, but opening as if it had always been a seam. And beneath it, space, depth, layers of earth that were no longer arranged like soil, but like stacked memory. And rising through it was presence. Not one entity, not many, a continuity, a system of things that had never fully separated. Daniel's mind refused to interpret it at first, but his body understood enough to stagger backward, because the shapes he had seen before, the partial figure, the hands, the impressions in the soil, were not individuals. They were extensions, parts of something that had been distributed through the land long before the burial. The coffin had not contained it. It had anchored it. And Daniel had been maintaining the anchor. The voice returned. But now it wasn't fragmented. It was complete enough to carry intention. Not language as humans use it, but recognition. A return of identity. And then, finally, it spoke in something close to understanding. Not through sound, but directly into perception. You stayed. Daniel's body locked. Not from command, from recognition. The presence wasn't asking. It was confirming. The farm had learned him the same way he had learned the farm. Step by step, night by night. The ground beneath Daniel softened again. Not to swallow him, but to position him. Like something adjusting an object to its correct place. He fell to one knee. Not pushed, not attacked, just aligned. And for the first time, he saw everything clearly. The farm was not haunted. It was organized. A structure. A buried network of awareness that had been dormant until a specific sequence of observation, disturbance, and attention reactivated it. And Daniel had completed that sequence. The burial had been the trigger. His curiosity had been the continuation. His returns to the grave had been the reinforcement. He had not been a victim of it. He had been participating in it. A final vibration passed through everything, and then stillness. Absolute stillness. Even the air stopped feeling like air. And in that silence, the entity finished forming its final understanding. Not of Daniel as a threat, not as prey, but as a replacement point, a witness, a continuation. The presence did not need to chase him anymore, because it had already extended through the ground beneath him, into his steps, into his choices, into his memory. Daniel tried to stand, but the moment he shifted his weight, he felt it. The soil was already responding before he moved. Anticipating, mirroring, learning. The last thing Daniel saw clearly was the farm as a complete shape. Not broken, not cursed, but awake, and expanding, quietly, patiently, into the surrounding land, as if waiting for the next person to notice it. Days later, the farm was found empty. No struggle. No signs of escape. Only the Gamalira tree split open at its base, like something had been removed from inside the world rather than from the soil. The grave was gone. Not filled. Not destroyed. Simply, no longer distinct from the rest of the ground. Locals avoided the area after that. But some said the worst part wasn't what disappeared. It was what remained. Because sometimes, when the night is completely still, the soil still moves slightly. Not digging. Not collapsing. Just adjusting. As if remembering the shape of someone who once paid too much attention to it. And every now and then, someone walking too close to the old farm path swears they hear something subtle under their feet. Not a sound, not a voice, just the feeling of being noticed back. And the strangest part? There is no longer any agreement about where the farm even begins. Maps shift slightly over time. Paths don't match what people remember. And the ground never quite feels the same twice. As if something underground is no longer waiting, but learning where to be next. The Procession of the Absent. This story took place in an old historic during Holy Week, around 2016. A professional photographer named Ethan Cole was sent to document the celebrations. Ethan worked for magazines and cultural publications. He covered festivals, religious events, and traditional ceremonies across the country. He had a simple rule: never return from a job without at least a few powerful images. When he was assigned to cover Holy Week in the historic town of Goiás, he was excited. It was one of the oldest religious traditions in the country. Stone streets, candlelight processions, chanting voices echoing through the night. Everything was perfect for photography. He arrived on Wednesday afternoon. The town was already in preparation. Church doors open, floats being decorated, people rehearsing chants in quiet streets. He stayed in a small guest house near the historic center. The owner, an older woman named Jasra, gave him a warning before leaving his room. "There is one thing," she said. "The Fogueiro procession begins at 1 in the morning on Holy Thursday. It is the most important one. But you must stay on the sidewalk. Do not cross the procession." Ethan found it strange. Crossing a procession? It sounded like superstition. He was a photographer. He needed to be in the middle of the action. That night, at 1:30 in the morning, he left the guest house with his camera, 2 extra lenses, and a tripod. The streets were already full. At exactly 1 o'clock, the bells rang, and the procession began. It was beautiful. Torchlight flickering. Purple-robed figures walking in pairs. The faracocos, hundreds of them, moving in silence. Behind them, a wooden float carrying the image of Christ. And behind that, the silent crowd. Only the sound of footsteps on stone and burning torches filled the air. Ethan photographed everything. From the sidewalk. From close range. From behind. But the lighting was difficult. Heavy shadows swallowed details. He needed a frontal shot. So he waited. Then he crossed the street. Just for a better angle. He raised his camera. The procession was coming toward him. Torchlight flickering across hidden faces. He took a flash photo. And that's when everything changed. On the camera screen, there were faces that should not have been there. Among the hooded figures, 3 people walking uncovered. An old man with a white mustache. A young woman in a floral dress. A barefoot child. Ethan lowered the camera. Looked directly. There was no one like that in the procession. Only hooded figures. Only silence. He looked back at the photo. They were there. Walking among them. He took another photo. Then another. In every single one, they were present. But something worse was happening. They were getting closer. In the first image, they were deep in the crowd. In the next, halfway forward. Then near the front. And in the final photo, the old man was staring directly into the lens. Ethan barely slept that night. He reviewed the images until sunrise, searching for logic. There was none. The next morning, he went down for breakfast. Jasra noticed his pale face immediately. He showed her the photos on his laptop. She went silent. Then she whispered, "Dear God, you saw them. The absent ones." Ethan frowned. "Who are they?" Jasra closed the laptop. As if she didn't want to look anymore. Long ago, during Holy Week, bodies could not be buried until after Easter. So the dead waited, and some say they still do. They walk among the procession, invisible to the living, but not to cameras. Ethan swallowed hard. I just crossed the street. Jassera shook her head. You crossed the procession, and when you break the line, they see you too. That afternoon, Ethan tried to leave. He packed his things, got into his car, started the engine, and looked into the rearview mirror. A man was sitting in the back seat, the old man from the photo, staring forward in silence. Ethan screamed, turned around. Nothing, only empty seats. But in the mirror, he was still there. Jassera stood at the doorway when Ethan returned. They're following you, aren't they? He couldn't answer. She nodded slowly. There is only one way. You must complete the Holy Week. Attend every procession. Stay on the sidewalk. Do not cross again. And after Easter Sunday, they release you. Ethan stayed. Friday passed. Saturday passed. Sunday came. He attended every procession. Always on the sidewalk. Never crossing. And slowly, they began to disappear. First the child, then the woman, then the old man. By Easter night, the mirror was empty. He left the town immediately, drove for hours, and never returned. All the photos from that week were deleted, because some traditions are older than explanation, and some boundaries between the living and the dead are thinner than anyone wants to believe. Some houses are sold with old furniture. Some come with cracked walls, leaking roofs, or forgotten boxes tucked away in dusty attics. The house we bought came with a debt. We just didn't know it yet. If someone had told me that a home could demand payment long after the mortgage was signed, I would have laughed. I believed debts belonged to banks, not buildings. Looking back now, I think that was exactly what the house wanted us to believe. My name is Adrian. In the spring of 2013, only a few weeks after my wife Claire and I got married, we found what looked like the opportunity of a lifetime. The listing almost didn't make sense. A spacious old house with 3 bedrooms, a wide backyard, solid hardwood floors, tall windows that filled every room with afternoon light. It stood on a quiet street in a small town where almost everyone knew each other. The price was so low that I asked the realtor to repeat it. He smiled awkwardly before explaining that the previous owner had recently passed away. His relatives lived far away and wanted the property sold as quickly as possible. That was all the explanation we needed. We emptied our savings, signed the paperwork, and within 2 months we were carrying boxes through the front door. The house felt peaceful. Old, certainly. The wooden floors creaked beneath our feet, but they felt sturdy. The kitchen still had faded ceramic tiles from decades earlier. Every room carried the faint scent of old wood, mothballs, and dust that had settled quietly over many years. It reminded Claire of visiting her grandmother when she was a little girl. She smiled every time she walked through the hallway. "It feels warm," she said one evening while arranging books on a shelf. "Like this house has been waiting for someone." I smiled back. If only we had understood what she really meant. The first week passed without a single strange event. We painted walls, repaired old cabinets, unpacked photographs. Slowly, it began to feel like home. Then, one quiet afternoon, the doorbell rang. I walked to the entrance almost immediately. When I opened the door, no one was there. The street was empty. No footsteps, no cars, not even the sound of children outside. I was about to close the door when something caught my attention. Resting perfectly against the threshold was a single yellowed envelope. There was no stamp, no address, no name, just the envelope. For some reason, before I even picked it up, an uncomfortable feeling settled in my chest, as though opening it would begin something that could never be undone. For several seconds, I simply stood there with the envelope in my hand. The paper felt strangely dry, almost brittle, as if it had been sitting untouched for decades instead of only a few moments. There wasn't a single footprint on the porch. No sound of someone walking away. Whoever had left it had vanished without leaving the smallest trace. Claire stepped into the hallway behind me. "Who's there?" I turned the envelope over. "No one." She frowned. "No one rang the bell and left this?" "I guess so." I closed the door, slid my finger beneath the flap, and unfolded the single sheet inside. The handwriting was uneven, faded, and trembling, as though it had been written by someone whose hands could barely hold a pen. There were only a few words. "First payment. 3 days of silence. Beginning today." Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then Claire let out a nervous laugh. "What kind of joke is this?" "I have no idea." She took the paper from my hand and looked at it again. "Maybe one of the neighbors is trying to scare the new owners." "It isn't funny." "No. But people do strange things." That explanation was comforting enough. I crumpled the note and tossed it into the kitchen trash. By dinner, we had already stopped talking about it. The evening passed like any other. We watched television, made plans for the backyard, talked about buying new furniture once we had recovered from the cost of the house. Before going to bed, I even remembered the envelope for a second and laughed at myself for taking it seriously. The next morning, I woke to the smell of fresh coffee. Claire was already in the kitchen. She smiled as I walked in. "Morning." The word formed clearly on her lips. But I didn't hear it. I answered automatically. Or at least, I tried to. Nothing came out. Not even a whisper. I frowned and cleared my throat. Again. Nothing. Air left my lungs. My lips moved. My throat strained. There was simply no voice. Claire's smile disappeared. She hurried toward me. "Adrian." She grabbed my arm, asking what was wrong. I watched her mouth forming words. Yet no sound reached me. Then I realized the horrifying truth. She wasn't hearing herself either. She pressed both hands against her throat, trying again and again to speak. Her chest rose with panicked breaths. Her mouth opened wider. Still. Absolute silence. Within minutes, we were desperately trying everything. We shouted, coughed, forced our voices until our throats burned. Not a single sound escaped either of us. The silence inside that house didn't feel natural anymore. It felt imposed, as if something unseen had quietly collected the first payment, exactly as the letter had promised. The drive to the hospital was one of the longest of my life. Neither Claire nor I could speak, so we communicated with hurried gestures and frantic looks. Every red light felt unbearable. Every minute that passed made the silence pressing against us feel heavier. By the time we reached the emergency room, my hands were shaking. The doctors examined us separately. They looked at our throats, our vocal cords, our mouths, our lungs. They ran every test they considered necessary. Nothing. Physically, we were completely healthy. One doctor frowned as he reviewed the results. He asked me to scream as loudly as I could. I took a deep breath. My chest tightened. The muscles in my neck strained. Not even the faintest sound escaped. His expression shifted from confidence to confusion. He called another physician. Then another. 4 hours, No one could explain what had happened. One specialist scribbled something on a notepad and slid it across the desk. Extreme stress can sometimes cause unusual symptoms. I stared at the sentence. Claire did the same. Neither of us had been under unusual stress. We had been happy, excited, planning our future. There was no explanation that fit what was happening. Late that afternoon, exhausted and frightened, we returned home with nothing but unanswered questions. The house stood exactly as we had left it. The windows reflected the fading light. The porch was empty. Everything looked normal. For a brief moment, I convinced myself the nightmare might finally be over. Then Claire froze beside me. She slowly pointed toward the front door. Another envelope. It rested neatly against the threshold, perfectly centered, as though someone had placed it there only seconds earlier. I rushed forward and threw the door open. The street stretched in both directions. Empty. No footsteps. No cars. No neighbors. Only a warm breeze drifting through the quiet afternoon. My pulse pounded in my ears. I looked down again. The envelope hadn't moved. With trembling hands, I picked it up. Even before opening it, I already knew it wasn't good news. The paper inside carried the same faded handwriting. Only 3 lines. Payment accepted. Next payment. 7 days without sleep. Beginning tomorrow. A cold knot settled in my stomach. I looked at Claire. She was reading over my shoulder. Her face had gone completely pale. She reached for my arm, gripping it so tightly her knuckles turned white. Neither of us could speak. Not because the curse still held our voices, but because, for the first time, we understood something far more terrifying. The first letter hadn't been a threat. It had been a schedule, and according to whoever or whatever was collecting that debt, the next installment had already been decided. The silence ended exactly when the letter said it would. Late on the 3rd evening, without warning, I felt something loosen inside my throat. I swallowed, cleared my throat once. Claire. The word came out rough, strained, but unmistakably mine. She looked up from the couch, her eyes wide with disbelief. Adrian. Her voice cracked as soon as she spoke my name. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then we rushed toward each other. We laughed. We cried. We kept talking simply because we finally could. After 3 endless days without a single spoken word, hearing another human voice felt almost unreal. For the first time since moving into that house, I believed we might survive whatever had happened. Maybe it was over. Maybe the second envelope had only been another cruel joke. That hope lasted until bedtime. Claire turned off the bedside lamp. The room fell into darkness. I closed my eyes and immediately opened them again. Something felt wrong. Not outside. Inside me. It wasn't ordinary insomnia. I wasn't restless. I wasn't anxious. I was tired. More tired than I had ever been in my life. Every muscle in my body begged for sleep. My eyelids felt heavy enough to collapse. Yet the moment they started to close, an invisible force seemed to pull them back open. My mind refused to drift. It remained painfully alert. Every tiny sound became impossible to ignore. The ticking of the clock. The refrigerator humming somewhere down the hallway. The soft rustle of leaves brushing against the windows. Hours passed. Neither of us slept. Morning came. Then another night. Still nothing. By the 3rd day, exhaustion had settled deep into my bones. My hands trembled constantly. Simple thoughts became difficult to finish. I caught myself staring at walls without remembering why. Claire looked worse. Dark circles surrounded her eyes. She dropped cups. Forgot conversations we had only minutes earlier. Sometimes she would stop walking through the house and simply stand still, blinking slowly, as if her body was trying to force itself asleep despite whatever held it awake. On the fourth night, the house changed. At least, I thought it did. As I sat on the edge of the bed, something moved in the corner of the room. A shadow. Too tall. Too still. I blinked. It disappeared. A few minutes later, I heard someone whisper my name. Soft. Patient. Close enough to make the hairs on my neck rise. I turned instantly. No one was there. When I looked back toward Claire, she wasn't looking at me anymore. She was staring at the empty space beside her pillow. Her lips parted. Her breathing became shallow. Without taking her eyes off that spot, she whispered only 4 words. Someone is sitting here. My blood turned to ice. Because the mattress beside her had begun to sink. I forced myself to keep looking. Every instinct told me to run, to turn on every light in the house, to do anything except stare at that empty side of the bed. But I couldn't. The mattress continued to sink, slowly, as though an invisible weight had just settled beside Claire. She never took her eyes off that spot. Her breathing grew faster. It's still there, she whispered, barely moving her lips. It hasn't looked at me once, but it knows I'm watching. A chill spread through the room. The air felt noticeably colder. I reached for the bedside lamp and switched it on. The light flooded the room. The mattress rose back into place. Nothing was there. At least, nothing I could see. Neither of us slept. Not that night. Not the next one. By the 7th day, we barely recognized ourselves. The world felt unreal. Colors seemed faded. Time moved strangely. Sometimes I would stand in the kitchen for several minutes before remembering why I had walked in there. Claire would begin a sentence and forget what she wanted to say halfway through. We weren't living anymore. We were simply waiting. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. That evening, an overwhelming wave of exhaustion crashed over both of us. I barely made it to the bed before losing consciousness. When I opened my eyes again, sunlight poured through the bedroom window. I had slept. Claire was still asleep beside me, breathing peacefully. For the first time in a week, the house was silent in a normal way. No whispers. No strange shadows. No crushing pressure. Only morning. For a few precious minutes, we allowed ourselves to believe it was over. Then I noticed the front door. There was something lying against it. My stomach tightened before I even stood up. I already knew. The envelope waited exactly where the others had. Perfectly centered. Untouched. As though it had been there all night. I picked it up with trembling hands. Claire stood beside me without saying a word. The paper inside contained only 3 short lines. Payment accepted. Next payment. 1 tooth from each of you. Tonight. Claire covered her mouth instinctively. I felt something inside me snap. No. My voice echoed through the hallway. No more. I crushed the paper in my fist and threw it across the room. This house is ours. We paid for it. I'm not giving it anything else. The words had barely left my mouth before the house became unnaturally quiet. Not ordinary silence. The kind of silence that feels as though something has stopped breathing, only because it is listening. Claire looked at me, her face drained of color. Adrian, she said softly, we have to find out what happened here. For the first time since the envelopes began arriving, we stopped asking what the house wanted. Instead, we started asking who had promised to pay before we ever walked through its front door. We left the house before noon. Neither of us said much during the drive. The envelope sat folded in the glove compartment, as if throwing it away would somehow make the words inside come true even faster. The realtor looked genuinely surprised when we walked into his office. He greeted us with the same polite smile he had worn the day we signed the paperwork, but it disappeared the moment he saw our faces. "You both look exhausted. I didn't bother sitting down. I want to know everything about the previous owner." He hesitated. "I already told you." "No." I leaned forward. "You told me he died." "That's not the same thing." For several long seconds, he stared at the desk. His fingers tapped nervously against a folder. Finally, he sighed. "The man's name was Victor. He lived in that house his entire life. When he died, no one noticed for almost a week." The room fell silent. "They found him alone. The body was already decomposing." Claire lowered her eyes. The realtor swallowed before continuing. "There were rumors." "What kind of rumors?" I asked. He looked toward the office door as if making sure no one else could hear. "They said he made a deal." "A deal?" "Years ago, the bank was preparing to take the house. He was desperate. He told people he would pay any price to keep it." I frowned. "Pay who?" The realtor slowly shook his head. "No one ever knew." He paused again. "But after he died." His voice dropped almost to a whisper. 3 different families bought that house. They all left within a month. Every one of them said the same thing. I felt my stomach tighten. "What did they say?" "They kept talking about payments." Claire's breathing became uneven. The realtor continued. "They said something inside that house kept collecting debts. No money. Pieces of their lives." The office suddenly felt too small, too warm. I remembered the silence, the sleepless nights, the shadow beside Claire, the envelope waiting at the front door every single time. Those families hadn't imagined it. Neither had we. When we stepped outside, the afternoon sun should have felt comforting. Instead, everything looked strangely distant. The town was alive around us. Cars passed. People talked. Children laughed across the street. It all felt disconnected from us. As if Claire and I were already carrying something invisible that no one else could see. Neither of us spoke during the drive home. There didn't seem to be anything left to say. That night, we locked every door, checked every window, covered the mail slot, sealed every gap we could find around the entrance. "If it can't get another envelope inside." Claire didn't finish the sentence. Neither of us believed it would matter. But we had to try something. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to a pain so violent that it felt like someone had driven a nail straight through my jaw. I sat upright, clutching my face. The taste of iron flooded my mouth. Warm blood spilled across my tongue. I stumbled into the bathroom and leaned over the sink. A thick stream of blood splashed against the porcelain. Then something hard struck the basin. I looked down. Lying in the center of the blood was one of my molars. Not broken, not cracked. It had been pulled out completely, root and all. Before I could even process what I was seeing, a scream echoed from our bedroom. "Claire." I ran before the scream had even finished echoing through the hallway. Claire was sitting upright on the bed, both hands pressed against her mouth. Tears streamed down her face. The white bedsheet beneath her was stained with small drops of blood. She slowly opened her trembling fingers. Resting in her palm was a tooth, a molar. Its root was still intact. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. We didn't have to. The envelope had been right. Again, there had been no footsteps, no visitor, no pain before we fell asleep. Yet somehow, while we slept, the house had taken exactly what it demanded. No more. No less. Claire began to sob quietly. I wrapped my arms around her, but neither of us found any comfort. The fear wasn't just that something impossible had happened. It was realizing the payments were no longer warnings. They were guarantees. Eventually, I forced myself to walk toward the front door. A part of me already knew what I would find. The envelope was waiting exactly where it always appeared, perfectly centered against the threshold. Untouched. I picked it up with hands that no longer felt steady. Claire stood several feet behind me. She didn't ask me to open it. She simply closed her eyes. The paper inside contained only 3 short lines. Payment accepted. Next payment. A child. In 9 months. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. A child. The words barely escaped my mouth. Claire stared at me in disbelief. We're not even trying. We've been careful. I know. Nothing about it made sense. Nothing about any of this made sense anymore. That afternoon, we searched everywhere for answers. Churches, old records, anyone who might know something about the history of the house. Most people simply looked uncomfortable. Some refused to speak at all. Late that evening, an elderly spiritual healer agreed to visit us. She entered the house slowly. She didn't ask us any questions. She walked from room to room in complete silence. Her fingertips brushed lightly across the walls. She paused in the hallway, closed her eyes, then inhaled deeply. The expression on her face changed immediately. She turned toward us. This house wasn't bought with money. Her voice was calm. It was bought with blood. The words settled over the room like a heavy fog. The man who lived here made a bargain with something far older than himself. She glanced toward the ceiling, then toward the floor beneath our feet. He offered his own life to keep this house. Her eyes met mine. But he died before the debt was fully paid. A cold weight settled in my chest. And now, she said quietly, the debt belongs to whoever lives here. I swallowed hard. Can it be stopped? For the first time since she arrived. She hesitated. The old woman lowered her eyes before answering. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely louder than a whisper. There is only one way. Claire stepped forward immediately. Tell us. You have to leave. Leave the house. Never return. The words hung in the air. I stared at her, waiting for something more. A prayer. A ritual. Anything. Instead, she slowly shook her head. There are some bargains that cannot be broken. They can only be abandoned. Claire's voice cracked. We put everything we had into this place. Our savings. Our future. The old woman looked at her with genuine sadness. If you stay, you'll lose much more than that. She refused our payment. Before leaving, she stopped at the front door without looking back. Whatever comes next. Don't mistake silence for mercy. Then she walked away. The next morning, I contacted every real estate agency in town. We listed the house for less than we had paid. Days passed. No offers. Not even a serious inquiry. People came to look. They admired the rooms, the backyard, the location. Then, somehow, they always changed their minds. One family canceled before entering the front gate. Another walked through the house for less than 5 minutes before leaving without explanation. It was as if the house chose who was allowed to stay. Desperate, we decided to abandon it. No furniture. No boxes. Just the two of us and whatever fit inside the car. We drove until the town disappeared behind us. For the first 20 minutes, nothing happened. Then Claire gasped. She grabbed her stomach. Her face lost all color. "Adrian!" Her voice trembled. "It hurts." The pain came without warning. She doubled over in her seat, breathing in short, desperate bursts. I pulled onto the shoulder. The contractions became stronger, one after another. She cried out every time another wave hit. "We have to get to a hospital." I started the engine again, but before I could turn toward the highway, Claire grabbed my wrist. "The pain." She looked confused. "It's stopping." Within minutes, her breathing slowed. The pain disappeared completely. The moment we turned the car back toward town, neither of us spoke during the drive. We didn't need to. The house had answered our attempt to escape. It wasn't keeping us there. It was keeping something else there. A week later, the pregnancy test came back positive. Claire stared at it in silence. It can't be. She had never missed a dose of birth control. We had taken every precaution. There should have been no pregnancy. Yet there it was. Clear. Undeniable. As I looked from the test to the house visible through the kitchen window, I couldn't shake the feeling that the next payment had already begun. The pregnancy advanced far too quickly for either of us to find any peace. Every doctor's appointment ended the same way. The baby appeared healthy. Claire appeared healthy. There was nothing medically wrong. Yet neither of us could forget the words written inside that envelope. A child. In 9 months. The pregnancy hadn't felt like a blessing. It felt like a deadline. For a few weeks, the envelopes stopped coming. That frightened me more than if they had continued. The house had become unnaturally quiet. No whispers. No footsteps. No shadows slipping across the corners of rooms. Only silence. The kind that waits. Then, one morning, I opened my eyes and immediately knew something was wrong. I looked at the framed wedding photograph on my nightstand. The woman beside me was smiling. I recognized her face. I knew she was my wife. But another thought struck me with terrifying force. I couldn't remember my mother's name. I sat upright. I squeezed my eyes shut. I tried again. Nothing. Not even the first letter. Panic surged through me. I searched through old memories, birthdays, family dinners, childhood holidays. Everything was there. Except her name. It had simply vanished. I stumbled toward the front door. The envelope was already waiting. I didn't hesitate this time. I tore it open. Payment accepted. Next payment. Childhood memories. My hands began to shake. The house wasn't taking random things. It was choosing them. Piece by piece. The person I had been was slowly disappearing. I rushed back inside. Claire was standing in front of the bathroom mirror. She wasn't moving. Claire. She turned toward me slowly. One hand covered her left eye. "I can't see." My heart lurched. "What do you mean?" "It's dark." She lowered her hand. Her left eye looked perfectly normal. No blood. No injury. No swelling. Yet she kept blinking, trying to focus. "I can only see with the other one." The ophthalmologist found nothing physically wrong. Her eye was healthy. Her vision was gone anyway. By then, we had stopped expecting doctors to explain the impossible. Every week, another envelope arrived. Every week, another payment was collected. Something invisible was stripping away our lives one piece at a time. Not enough to kill us. Just enough to remind us. The debt was still being paid. Outside, Claire's pregnancy continued normally. Inside the house, it felt as though we were growing weaker while something else was growing stronger. When the pregnancy reached its 9th month, I realized something that terrified me more than every envelope combined. If we waited for the next payment, the house wouldn't choose what it took. It would collect exactly what it had been asking for from the very beginning. And I couldn't allow that to happen. So, before dawn the next morning, I made the hardest decision of my life. I waited until Claire was asleep. For several minutes, I stood beside the bed, listening to her steady breathing. One hand rested gently over her swollen stomach. She looked peaceful for the first time in weeks. I hated what I was about to do, but I hated the thought of staying even more. Quietly, I walked into the garage. The gasoline can felt heavier than it ever had before. I carried it through every room we had once dreamed of filling with birthdays, family dinners, and ordinary memories. The living room, the hallway, the kitchen, the staircase. Each step left behind a sharp smell that quickly swallowed the familiar scent of old wood and dust. This house had taken enough. If it wanted a payment, it would have to collect it from ashes. I struck the match. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the flame touched the gasoline. A narrow line of fire raced across the floor. It spread with terrifying speed. Within seconds, orange light filled the hallway. Heat slammed into my face. The old wood crackled like dry bones. Smoke rolled across the ceiling. Windows burst one after another with deafening pops. Claire. She woke in confusion as I pulled her from the bed. What's happening? We have to go. Now. She barely had time to put on her shoes before I helped her outside. Together, we stumbled into the yard. The fire consumed the house with frightening hunger. Flames climbed through the windows. The roof groaned. Then, with a violent crash, part of it collapsed into the rooms below. For the first time since we had moved there, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in months. Hope. The house was dying. The walls that had trapped us. The rooms where every envelope had appeared. The place that had demanded pieces of our lives. It was all disappearing. Claire squeezed my hand. Neither of us spoke. We simply watched until the fire began to fade. Hours later, only blackened beams and smoking rubble remained. The nightmare was over, or so we believed. As the smoke slowly drifted into the night sky, something pale caught my attention near the center of the ruins. At first, I thought it was a piece of burned wood reflecting the moonlight. Then I realized it hadn't burned at all. Resting perfectly flat on top of the ashes, untouched by the flames, was a single yellowed envelope. My legs suddenly felt impossibly heavy. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it there. Instead, I walked toward it. Each step seemed louder than the last. The ashes shifted beneath my boots. The air still shimmered with heat. I bent down. My fingers trembled as I picked up the envelope. It was cool to the touch. Not even the edges were singed. Slowly, I opened it. For several seconds, I couldn't bring myself to look at the paper. The only sounds around us were the soft crackle of dying embers and Claire's uneven breathing behind me. Everything else was still. The house was gone, reduced to blackened beams, shattered bricks, and drifting ash. If the fire had destroyed anything, it should have destroyed that envelope. Instead, it looked exactly like the others. Untouched, patient, waiting. I unfolded the paper. The same faded handwriting stared back at me. Only 3 lines. Payment refused. Debt transferred. New residence. The child's body. My vision blurred. No. The word escaped before I realized I had spoken. Claire hurried toward me. What is it? I couldn't answer. I simply handed her the letter. She read it once, then again. Her face emptied of all color. The paper slipped from her fingers and disappeared into the ashes. She wrapped both arms around her stomach as though she could shield the baby from something neither of us could see. At that exact moment, she gasped. Her knees buckled. Another sharp breath. Then another. Adrian. She looked at me with terrified eyes. It's starting. Labor. There was no time to think. No time to mourn. No time to wonder whether the letter was telling the truth. I helped her into the car and drove faster than I ever had in my life. Neither of us spoke during the entire trip. The envelope remained on my mind with every mile. Debt transferred. I wanted to believe it was only another threat, another attempt to break us. But deep inside, I already knew the house had never lied. Our son was born before sunrise. The delivery was uncomplicated. The nurses smiled. The doctor congratulated us. They placed a healthy baby boy into Claire's arms. He cried loudly. His tiny fingers wrapped around hers. For one beautiful moment, the nightmare seemed impossible. I looked at him and thought perhaps we had escaped after all. Perhaps the fire had been enough. Perhaps the last envelope had only been one final cruelty. I wanted to believe it, more than anything. But hope had become a dangerous thing inside our lives. And before the first week was over, the house proved that it hadn't burned. It had simply moved. The first sign was so small that we almost convinced ourselves it was a coincidence. Claire warmed a bottle of milk while I held our son in the living room of the small apartment we had rented after the fire. The moment I carried him into the kitchen, Claire frowned. The milk had curdled. She stared at the bottle. I just made this. We threw it away and prepared another. The same thing happened. Then the flowers. A neighbor welcomed us with a bouquet a few days after we moved in. Fresh, bright, healthy. The instant Claire placed them beside the baby's crib, the petals began to droop. By the following morning, every flower had withered as though weeks had passed overnight. We stopped mentioning it. Not because we didn't notice, because we were afraid of saying it out loud. The animals noticed before anyone else. Dogs refused to come near his stroller. Birds scattered from trees as we walked beneath them. Even the stray cats that wandered through the neighborhood froze the moment they saw him. Their ears flattened. Then they ran. Weeks passed. Our son grew exactly as the doctors expected. Healthy, strong, always smiling. But every few days, we found another mark. A tiny wound. A bruise. A shallow bite-shaped impression on his skin. Never deep enough to leave lasting damage. Never serious enough for doctors to explain. Always appearing overnight. Always one more than before. Each time we found one, neither Claire nor I needed to ask the question that haunted us. We already knew. Another payment. One evening, while changing his clothes, Claire quietly counted the marks across his back. When she finished, she closed her eyes. I don't think they're healing. I looked closer. She was right. The older ones hadn't disappeared. They had only faded enough to make room for new ones. Our son looked up at us and smiled. Completely unaware. Completely innocent. That hurt more than anything the house had ever taken from us. Years have passed since then. He is growing into a quiet, kind boy. To everyone else, he's perfectly normal. But every week, without fail, a new mark appears somewhere on his body. No matter where we move. No matter how many prayers are spoken. No matter how desperately we try to protect him. The debt is still being collected. Only now, it no longer belongs to the house. It belongs to him. Sometimes people ask why we never bought another home. I never answer honestly, because the truth sounds impossible. Some debts can never be paid with money. Some bargains survive the people who make them. And some houses don't imprison the families who enter them. They simply decide who will keep paying after they're gone.